Very warm welcome to everyone that's joined us, wherever you are in the world this morning. My name's Tilly, and I'm jumping in for John as he's not able to make it this morning. But we're really, really excited to see so many of you here. I'm just going to pop a couple of you on mute at the minute, just because I'm getting a little bit of feedback from your cameras and your mics. If you want to pop your cameras on at any point, feel free to do so. But other than that, your cameras can remain off. So yeah, we're really, really delighted to welcome you to our coaching, our third and final workshop of this month. We hope you've been able to join the other sessions that have run throughout the month, but fear not, if you've not been able to join them, we do have links on our social media for you to catch up on demand. We'll also send you out a little email as well for you to catch up, and they'll be available on YouTube. I'm seeing a few more of you joining, so I'm just going to admit some more of you in. And I will hand over very shortly to Chris, who is our performance coach at Swimming Strong, and he will be able to guide you through coaching smarter using race analysis and the 3MT profiling. Please do feel free to follow us on social media. We'd absolutely love to see you over there. We also have a mailing list for you to join. We'd also love for you to keep in touch with regular content. Our direct messages are also always available, so please drop us some messages if you have any questions or comments throughout the presentation. And we've got a little Q&A at the end as well. So I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to hand over to Chris, who's going to guide you through the presentation today. Thank you.
Perfect, thanks Tilly. So morning everybody. I can't quite see everyone at the minute, so if I'm just staring at my screen, I'm not looking at anyone's faces right now. But from wherever you're joining us in the world, thank you so much for jumping on today, whether it's this morning or this afternoon for you. As Tilly mentioned, my name's Chris Alderton. I'm the performance coach with Swimming Strong, and I'm just going to go through a little presentation this morning, just covering how to utilize the race analysis and 3MT profiling systems to try and coach smarter or more effectively. So I'm just going to dive straight in with just a little bit of background for anyone who may not know who I am. So a little bit about myself. So I've been coaching and teaching for 16 years. Started very much as a teacher when I was still in my swimming career, but then moved into coaching fairly quickly. I've worked as an assistant coach at the University of Bath, and I was doing that for several years, cutting my teeth with Mark Skimming over there in Bath and trying to figure out the whole world of coaching. I then moved on to Team Bath AS, which was the age group and youth program in Bath, as the head coach. I've also been very fortunate to work with British Swimming, Swim England, currently Swim Wales. It's now my new role at the City of Newport, which is in South Wales. I'm now the head coach with that program. So I'm very fortunate to have some really strong programs. If anyone's aware of the Cardiff swimming program, who've had multiple Olympians, and Swansea not that far down the road, we've got a really good pedigree in South Wales. So it's great to be part of that system and to be working around coaches and teams at that level. I've been very fortunate to have worked with some incredible coaches over the years. I'll only name a few because it could go on for a while, but I was coached by a gentleman named Chris Nesbitt, who now coaches in Australia. I've a coach named Dave Kalea, who coached Graham Smith to an Olympic medal in the 1500 in 1996. Obviously working with Bill Sweetenham, John Atkinson, who's now in Canada. You know, whether it's under their guidance as a coach or under their guidance as an athlete, I've had some great exposure, and there's been a lot to learn from over the years. It's been a very humbling process. And just a little bit to relate to how I got involved with Swimming Strong and my relation to this whole process. I coached Eva when she first moved to the UK in 2011, I believe it was, and I started collaborating with her in the development of the 3MT system for swimming as part of a PhD process. And I was very fortunate that she wanted to come to me and work with me to help develop that principle. And we've worked together on this for several years now. So I've got a lot of experience working with the platform, and we've gone through all of the challenging times together. And it's great now that obviously it's a very functioning system that coaches around the world can use. So that was just a little bit about me, but just jumping in now to what I'm going to fundamentally be talking about today. So what I'm going to be trying to sum up with my little workshop this morning is looking at how we combine the ideas of race analysis, the profiling system with the 3MT, and using the Swimming Strong prescription tool to try and bring that all together to be able to systematically put together programs and how we coach more effectively and more efficiently. I know that's one thing from Eva's perspective and from mine that we've been trying to achieve is how do we get this information and make the coach's role and job within using that as effective and as smooth as possible. So I just want to touch really on the three key swimming strong tools that have been discussed in the last workshops, but for anyone who wasn't there for those, we're going to just quickly jump on them now. So the race analysis platform is ultimately how we utilize the key metrics derived from that across performances to identify and individualize goals so we can train with purpose. So how do we look at what our performance has been, use that information, apply it to the next training block or cycle, and then move forward with that process. The 3MT profiling system, which we'll touch on a little bit deeper in a moment, is just looking at how we build and understand each individual athlete's physiological profile, just to support us as coaches and them as athletes in how we move things forward and how we allow them to be as successful as possible within not just the planning, but within their ultimate performance. And then the prescription tool, how we use this prescription tool to structure and individualize training sessions and obviously pace prescription for individual swimmers and intervals and things of that nature, and how that all comes together using the 4-zone model that we're utilizing with Swimming Strong. So moving forward into a little bit about integrating data into the daily practice. And if you're on the previous workshops, you've probably seen this already, but I just wanted to touch on and cover on some of the terminology within the platform. So the critical speed that we derive from the 3MT test gives us our ultimate aerobic capacity, so we can utilize that metric to obviously train our zone 1 and zone 2 systems, but it also gives us a platform to then be able to work on the zone 3 and zone 4 side, and we'll look at that more deeply in a moment, to be able to build the higher speed and race specific side of our training. We utilize the principle of D prime, so looking at the overall anaerobic capacity, I guess you could call that. It involves things like your top sprinting speed or peak speed, and then working out your functional speed reserve. So what the difference between the critical speed and the peak speed, swimming speed is, that's that functional speed reserve. Just as some other technical sides from the platform, looking at the turning ability that athletes have, and that gets pulled in from the 3MT test as well. Just on a practical note from a coaching perspective, obviously the turning ability side, swimmers can very much turn faster in a one-off effort than the turn information that comes from the 3MT test. But what it allows us to do is integrate that into certain training sessions or certain training sets to allow us to help give extra skill and technique feedback to the athlete. So it's just a good tool to have to be able to give quick and immediate feedback to swimmers during sessions. You get the technical ability side, which involves the metrics for stroke length, stroke rate, and stroke index. And then just some useful splits that we get from the test when you get to the report, and I'll go over a report in a moment. You get the 25, 50, 75, and 100 meter splits. Again, these are just useful parameters. There are things within the platform and the pace prescription, which I'll go into shortly, also towards the back end of the presentation, that you'll be able to see the differences as to how those splits relate to then the different levels that you're working within the zone. So just to touch on something that Eva spoke about last week, just to give you a view of profiles for athletes. I won't go into the depth that she did last week, but I just wanted to touch on how profiles look and how they can vary. So we've got two examples of a swimmer, two swimmers. Swimmer 1, which is the top bar, and I've just noted that the swimmer 1 tab is not at the top there, so I do apologize for that. So swimmer 1 is at the top, swimmer 2 at the bottom there. Really quickly and really simply, you can quite clearly see in the critical speed or the aerobic side of these two profiles that swimmer 1, the one on the top, has a 1.5 meter per second or 68 per 100 critical speed, whereas the swimmer 2 has a slightly lower represented critical speed. So you can quite quickly see the difference within that. We look at the anaerobic capacity or the D prime side of it. If you look at the D prime number on swimmer 1 there, 33.86, and then 44.35 for swimmer 2, you can again quite clearly see the difference between the two swimmers in terms of the anaerobic side of it. And then obviously you've got the turn side. A couple of little areas that I noted just from seeing these profiles myself was the entry time for swimmer 1 into the turn is quite a way faster, almost a second quicker per entry, or their maximum entry speed. And just by looking at those differences between athletes, you can see where some of these areas to develop start coming out from the 3MT profile. Just a little thing to note, and we'll touch on this shortly as well when I go into the prescription side, the balance of these of the critical speed in D prime. These are things that we look at developing and building depending on the type of events that we're looking to build. And one thing I want to take some time on later on to touch on with the D prime side is it can be a bit of an odd number to see, 33 meters or 44 meters. But ultimately, once you get used to the principle of what it's doing, the higher the number is ultimately the more capacity you have to work above the critical speed. So that could be within the volume of an actual training set itself, or it could be throughout a training week. How much volume at a higher intensity can an athlete tolerate potentially? And obviously there's variations within that from day to day or even week to week. But that is one of the things that I look at from a coaching point of view, rather than just the figure itself, that it's about how much more work they could do in that area. So just want to touch on the zone system that we're utilizing with Swimming Strong. So on the right-hand side, you've got our 4-zone system. We've got zone 1, which is up to the first lactate threshold. We've got zone 2, which works between the first lactate threshold and the critical speed. Zone 3 works from the critical speed up to the maximum pace at VO2 max. And then zone 4 is when we start going into that speed or almost purely anaerobic area of the systems. And I'll touch on some of the elements around programming and planning side in that shortly. And there's some really good information just on the remainder of the table here, just around different methodologies that different programs or different governing bodies utilize in terms of their zonal system. I think fundamentally a lot of it is basically does the same thing. Different people just lay it out in different ways. And I know I've personally found working with swimmers daily that having a simple 4-zone system gives them a little bit more of a clear idea and understanding about where they are on that day. And there's lots of other things you can relate that to, like nutrition, preparation, and things of that nature. So that's a very brief overview of things that if you've been on the last couple of calls, you've probably already seen. So what I want to start diving into is just a little bit of discussion around, firstly, how we plan for development stages, or we use the system for different development stages. So having used the system for several years now across quite a spanning time with various athletes, being able to track that data is given quite significant insights as to the development process and speed of different athletes along their athletic journey. And it's quite interesting how you build up different models within different athlete types that you see on the platform or through data that can start giving you an understanding about how someone may respond to training, how someone might respond to a different style of planning for the week or for a cycle. So I've found that tracking the data really gives you a strong insight over time as to how you can develop those systems. And I touched on at the start that one of the things from my perspective is how we use things like the platform, or we use physiology to be able to make our time more efficient as coaches. For me, this is one that's over time really helped me become more efficient with my planning and with my session design. You know, it's almost simplified it in a lot of ways. So I've already touched on the idea that we could build templates for different groups of athletes within various stages of development. And I'm going to touch on some of those groupings that I'm currently utilizing at the moment in a couple of slides' time. So the 4-zone system from a coaching perspective, again, and I've touched on this already, allows us to really simplify the process of training, especially when it comes to communication with athletes and parents. Maybe not everyone on the call today works with parents. Maybe you work with senior athletes, but in my current context, I work with parents and swimmers, and we always try and look at this as a group effort, trying to set the objectives and understand where we're going. I found very much that the 4-zone system has allowed us to very easily communicate what different types of work are important for an athlete, and we can then back that up with the data, and then back that up with the race analysis side of things to say, well, this is a pretty clear area that needs to be developed. This is what we can do from a training planning perspective to allow us to be able to develop that system, and we can do it over this period of time and then evaluate. And obviously, from that last point, combining the reporting and then that race analysis side really does inform that planning and decision making process. And I think the big part from my perspective is that how we then bring the athletes and parents into that process. So one, they understand, as I've already said, but secondly, how they then integrate into that and they feel part of that process and journey. So put together a little slide here just on the second side of this planning for different development stages. And this is a very brief overview, almost like a satellite view of some concepts or some basic ideas that I put into play and from using the system, but also just from general reading outside of just not our system, but within other systems people have used before. That we start in the top left there, looking at capacity and then specific fitness. I think how we build capacities and how we build then the ability to develop specific fitness for different race events, we need to be doing that over a period of time. So using profiles and performance insights from things like race analysis to understand the targets for capacity. So you may have had athletes in the past that they've swum a certain time and you've got a profile, and at that time their critical speed was say 1.50 meters per second, their D prime was this. And then you have an athlete or athletes in the future that may be swimming the same event or have the same goal time for that event. You can start building up a picture of what kind of parameters do those swimmers who swim that time or to that level possess. So then you can then use that as an objective and a goal setting process with athletes, and again involving parents to help them understand how we build the capacity to be able to do that and to perform in that way. I think building a broad and robust engine and then fine tuning it as you go through a career or even through a season, if you want to look at it from a single year perspective, I think that's an important process that in order to be able to, and as an F1 fan, the way that I would almost explain it is if you want to build that Formula One engine that is the fastest on the track, you've got to have one, the size of engine, and then the power element and the horsepower of that engine comes in second. So we've got to build that size and build the robustness of that engine across different training intensities and zones. And then we fine tune it over time to make it a strong machine that will be able to get the objectives and performance that we require. And finally, just on that capacity and specific fitness side, I think clearly defining the objectives of what the training cycle or the period of time that you are working with an athlete is there to do. So I look at it from the perspective physiologically of investments and withdrawals. So, and I'll touch on this in a moment with the age group side, but if you investing in your performance or investing in your capacity for work is things like developing your anaerobic capacity, so your D prime, and then developing your critical speed or your aerobic capacity. So looking at those two things as you go through a season or a 4-year cycle or a career, we always want to be investing and putting money into that system. So then when we make withdrawals out of things like zone 3 and zone 4 training, so VO2 work, critical speed work, really solid and hard anaerobic sets as we get closer to racing, those withdrawals don't become huge withdrawals from a bank account that we don't have a lot of funds in. So that aerobic side is about investing in and putting money in it all of the time and really building that up. And then over time, as you withdraw, your withdrawals are only a small percentage of what you've got in the bank, if that makes some sense. I hope that analogy didn't just completely fall down, but hopefully that made a little bit of sense. So touching on that right-hand side at the top there, just looking a little bit around age group athletes. So obviously we want to build aerobic capacity and critical speed with age group athletes. And I'll come back into this with the prescriptions side shortly when I go into the system. But in terms of building that capacity and critical speed, ultimately looking at zone 1 and zone 2 work to help build up that engine. Developing our speed and D prime, so that zone 4 side. So we're not necessarily neglecting zone 3, that VO2 really high-end critical speed work. We're not neglecting that area, but I think building a strong top end and a really strong bottom end, so then you have an area to move into later on in a career or in the development process, is an important part of making sure that someone has the capacity to be able to really move on their performance and develop themselves. Doesn't mean, again, that we neglect that zone 3 area. We can move through it, we can descend through it, I think age groupers doing work in that area can be really good when they move through the zone and it goes from, say, zone 2 to zone 4 and they move through. But I think doing big blocks in zone 3 is something that can be reserved for athletes who we feel like are ready for that work, and in terms of maturity, psychologically as well, because it's very challenging, and just physically in terms of their development and their process. And obviously there are significant opportunities for athletes to be technically efficient and develop race skills when you're focusing on that zone 1 and 2 area and that top end speed zone 4 side, because the rest is a bit longer in some respects at the zone 4 end. In the aerobic capacity zone 1 and 2 areas, obviously things are going to be shorter rests. You can build them in over time, but it's at a slow enough intensity to allow them to be technically efficient and develop skills at that low level and then apply in that top end later on. So moving into youth athletes, obviously we want to look at continuing to build capacities, that critical speed and D prime. But then we could start introducing more race-specific qualities that are more physiologically demanding and also specific to future racing performance. So that zone 3, that VO2 max zone, essentially, where that starts to become a big component. We are developing D prime in that zone 3 in some respects, in different ways, depending on where you place yourself on it. But we're starting to build that more race-specific engine that will start developing power and fine tuning for an athlete as they start going into the youth side of it, and then finally into the senior end, where from a senior perspective, we're looking to try and train to become more specific and individualized in nature. Maybe not in my program right now, but maybe in your programs, if you're in a senior level, you may have less athletes that you're working with. At the moment, I think my group's got 24 athletes in it. So how we individualize, and I'll touch on that shortly, is a little bit more constrained. But you may have a group that have less people in it. You might be able to be in a situation where you can very much specifically say, this is your program, this is your session, and you'll be able to have the capacity to do that. Another point from a senior athlete perspective, I think maintaining the capacity, so the critical speed D prime, and topping them up periodically is an important factor in maintaining a longevity of performance. I think it's very easy to go straight into a very specific program where it's all race driven, race pace focused, but almost neglecting that base building and not having to do it all of the time, but maybe every season coming back to it. Some athletes may have built up such a great engine in their age group and youth career that they may not have to go back to a level of base building for maybe 2 to 3 years. So you could do a whole quad cycle and only really have a small period of time where they're base building, but then the rest of it, you're really trying to hone and fine tune that top level performance that's going to get them that extra half a second to win a medal. And maximizing race qualities as a senior athlete, I've already touched on that. So that's just a little bit around the whole planning for development stage part. So I hope that's made some level of sense. This is just things from my perspective that I've taken from my experience from a coaching point of view and utilizing the platform. I'm sure there's always 100 ways to do various different things, but these are just some ideas and some base principles that I think work pretty well. So just want to look a little bit now at planning for individual needs. So I talked earlier on in the workshop about how we start learning and understanding from profiles different types of athletes that either swim a time or an event that can help guide us into understanding where swimmers need to get to with their capacities. So 3 particular profile types that I currently break my groups and my swimmers into are sprint profiles, a hybrid profile, and an endurance profile. Now, instead of breaking that down just into distances, and each athlete has their own distance that we're looking to develop within the group they're in. These are more based on the physiological profile side. So a sprint swimmer, generally speaking, has a higher D prime and a slightly lower critical speed. So they're a little bit more top heavy and a little bit either underdeveloped aerobically, or they just don't have a huge system in that area. And that could be, even sprinters who race 200 meters. So you can have different types of event profiles within that one area. But those guys tend to have that, again, high D prime, low critical speed. The hybrid swimmers, or the hybrid group, they tend to have a fairly good balance between their critical speed and their D prime. The D prime tends to be a slightly stronger element, whereas the critical speed is better than the sprint profile would be. However, it's still not a really, really high-end critical speed, and they're almost working very much in conjunction and balance with each other. And just from looking at profiles for quite a period of time, hybrid swimmers tend to be swimmers that I see that are fairly good across different distances. They can move across things from the 50 even up to the 400, and they can go through that quite smoothly. And they can do all the different events, and they don't seem to have a problem with being able to do all of those events. So again, this is kind of how we can take baseline physiological profiles and then start adding in more specific event profiles as well to understand how different swimmers work. And then finally, endurance profile, which tends to be your classic distance swimmer, high critical speed, D prime that in most cases is fairly low, more into the 10 or below. So you would have saw from the examples that I showed earlier on, there was a 33 meter and a 44 meter. Those are pretty good D prime scores. I think swimmer one would have, in my categories at the moment, would have been more of a hybrid, whereas swimmer two would have been a bit more of a sprint swimmer or sprint profile. But yeah, the endurance profiles are a little bit more the other way. Really high critical speed. D prime, that tends to be low, maybe a little bit higher depending on the swimmer and what kind of event or what kind of training experience they've had. So just from a practicalities point of view, most swimming programs have large groups. Again, I mentioned that my group has got 24 in at the moment. They've all got different needs, different training abilities. They're all in different parts of their journey, different ages. So using profiles like this, even with these three simple ones that I've explained today, it just allows a coach to plan things out a little bit more simply, and you don't sit there for hours on end trying to plan out individual groups or individual racing strokes or distance. You can kind of put them into these bigger pots, and then within the pot you can start looking then at the strokes and maybe how that would look through a week. So I think you can get as specific as you want to in this area, but I think these general profiles are some three really do that. And obviously, I think what a big message I want to share, and something that I've learned the hard way in some respects, is that individualizing your program doesn't require you to plan a session for each athlete. And I'm going to touch on it in a moment with an example of a session that I've done this week with my group, that it doesn't have to be so individualized that each person's got their own. You can use quite broad processes to then be able to break things down within different groups. So just wanted to share a quick example of a session that I've done this week with my group. This was very much focused on zone 4 work, and for the distance swimmers, it was some zone 4 into some zone 2. And I'll explain a little bit about what I was trying to get from that in a moment. So this is a very small screenshot of the actual content. I've taken all the names off the session and things like that. So if we kind of look into the middle section of the session, you can see that the 100 meter group, 200, and then the 400 plus group, if you look at it from the perspective of, I've essentially used those distances, I use those racing event distances to basically put them into a sprint, hybrid, and then endurance profile grouping. Now, some of them have mixed around a little bit because we're getting to the stage of the season now where we're racing in about 5 to 7 weeks' time. So I want to relate it a little bit more now to some of the racing elements of the things that they're actually going to be competing in several weeks, which is why I went for the 100 meter, 200 meter, and the 400 plus group. But those profiles are generally overlaid with those 3 different types of sessions. So with the 100 meter group and the 200 meter group, my objective here was to pitch their training into zone 4. So very much working on their D prime. If you want to look at it from another perspective, working them anaerobically with fairly good rest, especially after the push rep on each set. So the essential structure here was there was a dive rep and then a push rep. The dive rep was on a 2-minute interval because we were limited with pool space. So I wanted to try and keep it fairly linear in terms of the set structure, so I could get all the swimmers doing the things they needed to within a small amount of lane space. And then we had the push effort off the back of that, off the 2-minute interval. So obviously with the varying different levels of intensity for the different race speeds that we're looking at there, the 2-minute rest interval interacts with that 50 very differently depending on, well, not very differently depending on what level that you're working to. So the individualization side here is that each swimmer had their own specific race speed to work to. And what I'd done is I'd taken their goal time for their events, the swimming in 7 weeks, overlaid that with what the 3MT prescription tool showed me, and then I started working out how much volume they may do for that particular set and what kind of rest interval that they may use. But then fundamentally, how mindful I may need to be as to how much volume of this set they can actually do. So each round there on the 100-200 group was times 6, but it's worth noting that there were 1 or 2 swimmers that we actually stopped quite a bit earlier than that, just for lots of different reasons. One athlete because they'd had quite a busy day with school and other activities and they were a little bit fatigued. One athlete because they just didn't quite look like they were on it today, on that day. I think the session the day before it hit them a little bit harder than intended, so we kind of backed out the sets a little bit. But what it allows me to do is allows me to set a volume target, but whether we get to that target is purely depending on what the athlete is displaying on that day, because there are always huge variations in their ability to be able to execute the right skills and technique fundamentally, but then obviously the race pace or the pace that we're looking to hit within the set. And the 400, 800, 15 group, what I was essentially looking to do with them is do a little bit of 400 work just from the blocks and working on their second 50. From my group's perspective, they struggle a little bit with that opening 100, then going into the second 100 and holding pace in the way that I'm looking to try and develop. So we're looking at how we do that and how we build systems to allow them to practice it. And then off the back of it, we went into, as I mentioned already, some zone 2 work. I kept it fairly unspecific in terms of giving them a goal time, but they had a dropping interval time on each set. So each 200 just got slightly quicker. And then we had an easy one on the 5th rep. Each round got that a little bit quicker as we went. And although from the Swimming Strong system, it doesn't have a heart rate site integrated into the system, I did have a heart rate monitor on those swimmers just so I could keep a check of what the heart rate was. And from my perspective, utilizing the heart rate, it's more of a monitoring tool, so I can see what it's doing, how it's interacting with the set. Is it staying stable? Is it shooting up? Because things like shooting up quite high within the heart rate on the end of a set like that 15-200s may represent that they're starting to fatigue quite heavily and they're starting to get very close to their VO2 max, which may mean they're either fatigued, underfueled, or maybe the set has been pitched a little bit too hard. They were all pretty stable as we went through the set, which was a good thing. But this is just a very simple overview of how I've taken information from the system, and I've color coded it blue because in our program the zone 4 side is the blue color. We've overlaid it with some zone 4 work. The distance guys have then done some zone 2 work, and it's just a really simple way of me explaining to them, this is the zone we're working in. This is the kind of activity that we're expected to do. These are the things that we're looking to try and achieve from it. So it's a simple way of communicating. So just a quick little summary before I jump into the platform quickly, just to run through some basics of the prescription tool. So ultimately what we're trying to do is take the race analysis that John spoke about, the physiological profile, which Eva went into depth with last week, and how we bring all of that together from a coach's point of view to make it practical and to help us increase the performance of each individual athlete as much as we can. I think we're all very pragmatic people, and we're trying to find ways to do that as efficiently, as effectively as we can. It allows us to effectively communicate the planning process to the athletes. And again, maybe this is not everyone's context, but to parents as well, to make sure everyone understands what we're trying to achieve and how we're trying to do it. You know, we're combining data-driven understanding, so things that are grounded in research, with the art of coaching. And I know as coaches, it's easy to look at data, and I think it's very important to not just take data as gospel. There are always variations within it. And I know that, again, that's something I've learned from using data quite a lot over the years, that it's not the be all and end all at all times. It is a guide and a framework to be able to help you understand, well, if an athlete is swimming this pace and we're looking to try and develop this area, this is the kind of thing that I'm looking at and trying to do. And that can help you just pitch your training, plan your training, and give you a really good idea around what you should expect from each athlete. Building consistency into programs to maximize performance and investment. I think that's a fundamental side of what Swimming Strong is trying to achieve, that we're trying to allow programs to maximize everything they're doing. And I talk about this with my athletes, that when the athlete invests in the program, the coach invests in the program, and we've got a system that helps support that, I think that's when we get the best out of everyone. So it helps everyone see what needs to be invested to be able to achieve the top result that they want. And again, it ultimately allows coaches to simplify the whole training process. And hopefully that has made some level of sense as I've gone through this. And with the workshops from John and Eva, you've hopefully seen that there is a simple process behind what can be a potentially complex process. So real quick, so I just clicked out a bit too early there. So that's the fundamental side of the workshop done. What I'm going to do is just quickly pop into the pace prescription tool on the Swimming Strong platform, and I'm just going to quickly run through each training zone and just give some base insights into some of the learnings that I've had within utilizing the system. I won't take too long over this. It'll all be fairly simple and quick, but I just want to try and make sure that, again, we all see this as a tool to be used to overlay things with. And just because the data says X, Y, and Z doesn't mean that we have to take that as gospel at all times. And there's always variations within it. So I just wanted to quickly run through each section. So just from that zone 1, that first lactate threshold section at the top there in blue. So ultimately, when we want to build our aerobic base and our technical base, this is the area that we're going to generally pitch it at. If you've utilized beta below max before, it generally sits, if you sit on the threshold. So with this athlete, if we put 100% of their threshold for, say, 200 meters with 10 rests for 10 reps, if we pitch it at this level, generally speaking, whoops, what have I missed? I've missed something. Oh, it's failing to upload. For whatever reason, it's not liking what I'm doing there. Sorry about that. So essentially, when you put it on that first threshold, what you will tend to find is with different athletes, it can vary in terms of, if you use something heart rate as well, where that heart rate would sit within that system. It may be that for some athletes sitting at 100% of the first lactate threshold or on that first area, that would be a 50 beats below max swim, for example, and that might be what it maintains at. It could be for a slightly less developed athlete, maybe an age grouper, maybe for someone who doesn't have a historically well-built aerobic base, it could be that they are slightly higher heart rate, and you may even need to decide to pitch it down slightly lower if heart rate is what you're looking to achieve. But it also may be the fact that you may just need to pitch it on that area, and they just have to handle and develop the ability to tolerate that type of work. But with most of these training zones, what my tendency is that I'll tend to pitch them lower. So within the system, I'll pitch them at maybe 95%. And again, I do apologize. I'm not sure why it's failing to load right now. So it's not bringing up all of the times, but I can still utilize the bars to show you guys what I would normally do. I would tend to pitch swimmers a little bit lower in the system to be able to then build them up slowly. My personal tendency is to stick with the distances that I'm looking to develop and then build the intensity up through there. You could even play with the rest as well. You might start with 20 and then drop it to 10. There's lots of different ways to utilize and do that. And again, there's no limitations to how you approach this and how you vary it. It's just it's a tool to be able to use. Now, when we hit this zone 2 side, I think this for me is where things get quite broad in their use. So it's I know Eva's talked about utilizing this system, and I'm hoping this is going to work this time. If it doesn't, I do apologize again. No, I don't know why that's not working at the moment. So the zone 2, when you're swimming at the critical speed, that is a fairly high intensity level, and there's a variation there that you may have some athletes that could do 30 to 40 minutes on that threshold. Those, from my experience, will tend to be distance swimmers that could do that. But again, in terms of looking to how to progress athletes through this, especially age groupers, starting to use this zone and pitching them maybe even down lower in the system into the zone of maybe 7.5% below the critical speed, and utilizing the system in that way, it will just help give you a guideline as to, well, if they swim this speed, which is several percent below this critical speed or anaerobic threshold, this is the kind of time they'll hit. And if you're monitoring their heart rate, or if you're monitoring their pace or over time, you might actually see that they may actually be swimming at 95%, but if you give them a safety buffer, again, it's not working now. If you give it a safety buffer, then they've always got room to maneuver, and you can always understand as a coach that there's levels of safety that are being built into the training that you're doing. Now, there's always going to be times of the season where it's time to start pushing forward and go all in, and then you can start really pushing them into really hard levels of work within each zone. But I think if you want to be developing and building them up into it and utilizing this for the first time, you can set it at lots of different levels to be able to progressively build them up and build them in. And again, it's a little bit more challenging with it not pulling in the information. You know what I'm going to try? I'm going to try bringing the female athlete up and see if that works. Let's have a look. No, I'm not sure why that's not working. Do apologize. Oh no, there we go. It's working for the female athlete. So good timing, actually. So if we look at this female athlete with this zone 3, so what we call the depletion zone, but ultimately this zone develops both critical speed and VO2 max, and can be used for race pace training as well. So this for me is probably one of the most interesting areas, because there's a lot of variations that can be done with it. You could just go along the lines of a very clear-cut critical speed set or VO2 development set, where you follow some basic guidelines of 2 to 3 minute reps, pop in let's just say 6 repetitions, gives you about 12 minutes worth of work. This particular swimmer, short course, would be swimming 1:59. That's pretty good as a female, very good. And they'll be on a 3-minute interval. So again, this is a demo swimmer. I mean, if there's some swimmers out there that are doing this pace, then that's awesome. But what this allows you to do is this would show you that the swimmer is swimming at pretty much around 100% of their critical speed. So what this would then indicate to me straight away is this swimmer's D prime wouldn't be very high, because they don't jump too heavily into the zone 3 side. Once you start adding up the percentages, I'd probably expect a 40% to jump a little bit. Oh, it's not even changing. Okay, so that would be a very low D prime. Interesting. So it's either not working or it's not playing ball with me again. But basically, as you start going into zone 3, you are fundamentally, as long as you get the rest side right, you are fundamentally starting to develop your VO2 max. And there's obviously a lot of anaerobic components that start bringing itself into that zone 3, especially as you get higher and higher into the zone and you start topping up the percentages, because you can do things within the platform, like add 100-meter reps in there. But what you start to see is that you'll start seeing, generally, obviously, I'm pretty sure that whoever this athlete is, or the demo athlete, the D prime is probably not been entered very high. But generally, what you would find with even a fairly low D prime is this percentage of critical speed number would start creeping up from 100% as you start increasing the percentiles. So the higher into the zone you get, so all the way up to 80%, you start getting more anaerobically driven, if that makes some sense. You're still going to have an aerobic component because of the intervals that you would be utilizing within that, but you're still going to have a fairly balanced approach within that zone. As to where you pitch yourself within it will then dictate what kind of work you are, or what kind of part of the system you're actually developing, and what you're trying to develop it for. Because the higher you go into this zone 3, the more you will start depleting the D prime battery, but you'll also start developing the body's ability to utilize it as well. So zone 3 is a very flexible and very strong training area that can be utilized at the right times to great effect, but can also put swimmers in quite a big hole if it's overused and overdone. And then from a speed perspective, again, let me try the female athlete side. Quickly pop something in. So one of the reason that it's not working now for some reason. So the swimming strong system within the speed zone, it actually limits you to 100-meter distance within the speed component. Now, ultimately, the purpose of that is just to ensure that when you are swimming a speed from that 100-meter target down, then depending on the rest, I mean, you could work in fairly broad space of rest intervals, but the more rest you take, the more anaerobically you are starting to drive things, and the more specific you're trying to become around developing the D prime battery and really developing that top end speed. So the rest interval becomes probably the most important part of this as well. And I've talked about in some of the other zones there about progressing athletes through it. I think even working at 25s in this zone can be quite a very heavy impact activity for certain swimmers. So I think how you build them through, how you play with the different distances and vary that challenge for them throughout the season can be really impactful to developing that top end speed side. And then obviously layering that in as you go with adding in more zone 3 or working on more zone 2, generally working on zone 4, zone 2 and zone 1 together across a cycle. They're ultimately building capacities. They all work fairly well together. That zone 3 is where we need to start thinking about things in terms of planning weeks a little bit more carefully. So again, I do apologize for some of the little technical issues there I've had with this demo account today. So I apologize I couldn't get all that up. That is pretty much everything that I wanted to run through today. Now, I'm just going to quickly pop the presentation back up. So my email address with Swimming Strong is on the screen at the moment. So if anyone does have any further questions beyond today that they want to email and ask, if you want to share any ideas, I'm more than happy to have you email me and contact me with any information that you're interested in finding out, or anything that I can help you with from a training prescription perspective. Please don't hesitate to pop me an email. So if there's any questions, please either fire away or pop them in the chat. I think Tilly's in the background controlling all that at the moment. But yeah, if there's any questions, then please fire away. But if not, it's been great having you listening, and hopefully this has been informative. And the last 2 workshops have also given you a great understanding around the Swimming Strong platform.